Home at last! Get me a beer and a gourmet steak, would ya? I had just returned from shopping when I saw unfamiliar bags sitting there. I was wondering what they could be when I was suddenly hit with this rude comment. I recognized that voice, and as I looked up, feeling a wave of discomfort, there stood Louis, my ex-husband who disappeared 3 years ago. Ignoring his smug grin and condescending gaze, I walked into the house without saying a word. Not getting a reply, Louis followed me, chatting away annoyingly. I acted as if I couldn't hear him. Ignoring Louis's chatter, I walked around the house and began stuffing everything I needed into a random bag. Hey, don't ignore me! You know I hate being ignored! Unable to tolerate being dismissed, Louis yelled, grabbed my arm, and turned me towards him. What's the deal? I come home and you treat me like this? Shaking off his grasp, I answered firmly. Fine then, I'm going to my parents' home. Parents' home? What? Clearly not understanding what I meant, Louis looked bewildered. Leaving him standing there, I walked out of the house, took out my mobile phone, and made a call, as I headed towards the comforting sanctuary of my parents' home. My name is Crystal. I'm now 73 years old. I first met Louis when I was fresh out of high school and had just started my first job. We were colleagues in the same department. It was my first experience in the working world and I was utterly clueless. Seemingly taking pity on me, Louis would always find me when I was struggling and offer his help. I started to fall for him because of his kindness. Louis seemed to feel the same way, and as I started getting used to my job, he suddenly asked me out. Caught off guard by his sudden proposal, I hesitated and put off giving an answer, but he persisted, never giving up his pursuit. Drawn to his straightforwardness, I finally took the plunge and asked him to be with me. To my delight, Louis agreed instantly, and we were married before we knew it. After a short time, I found out I was pregnant, but by the time our child was born, Louis had become a different man. While I was knee-deep in parenting, Louis was consumed by his job. Day after day, he'd come home late and leave for work so early, I wondered if he ever slept. Even as our child grew and events like school ceremonies and sports days became frequent, Louis showed no interest in participating. Our child was feeling the absence, and when I tried to talk to Louis about it, he yelled, "Who do you think is paying the bills? Just handle it yourself!" And from then on, he grew increasingly distant. Louis started coming home even later, often not coming home at all. When he did show up, he'd reek of alcohol, stumbling in drunk. When I'd ask what he was up to, he'd scream, "I'm entertaining clients! It's work, okay?" After that, I stopped confronting him. Years went by, and Louis reached retirement age, but even in retirement, he continued to work every day. Though I didn't know the details, he seemed to have a late retirement job and was still coming home late, apparently hitting the bars. But there was one change. Now the money he spent on these so-called business dinners came from his own pocket. We had to start worrying about our finances since our child was off to college. Although Louis made a decent income, it was now a concern. That's why I started a part-time job, but the money for Louis's entertainment expenses was coming from that income. At this point, I was at a loss about what I was even working for. Our living expenses were being drained by Louis's business dinners, and Louis wouldn't settle for cheap things, not after all these years. So I worked my hardest and budgeted meticulously. Eventually, Louis's late retirement job also came to an end. Thanks to my careful budgeting, we'd saved up just enough for a little luxury. After years of working at the same company, Louis finally retired. While he seemed aimless during the day, he still went out on his nightly escapades. Though not as often as when he was employed, he would still snatch some money from me and head out. Each time he returned, the scent of alcohol clung to him, indicating his destinations hadn't changed. Deciding this couldn't go on and eager to finally spend quality time as a couple, I proposed a trip to a long-desired tourist destination. A trip? With you? Why should I... well, sure, let's go. Though he seemed reluctant at first, a long stare into my eyes seemed to convince him. Had I looked that serious? I had no clue what went through Louis's mind, but thrilled by his agreement, I started making arrangements right away. First stop, choosing a hotel. I went through my phone and travel magazines, discussing multiple options with Louis as we settled on one. He didn't seem all that interested, but I decided not to back down this time and continued making preparations. Just when everything was set and all that remained was to wait for the day, Lewis's phone rang. Picking up the call as he left the living room, he said, "Oh, golf overnight next Thursday? Great! What time should I be there?" The joy in his voice unsettled me. We were supposed to leave for our trip next Friday. If he goes golfing overnight on Thursday, he might not make it back in time. I waited restlessly for Lewis to come back. "All right then." As Lewis ends the phone call with a smile, I quickly ask for confirmation. "Lewis, you remember next Friday, right?" "Next Friday? The trip we're going on, remember?" "Oh, that. We're leaving in the evening, right? I'll make it." "Are you sure?" When Lewis gives a dismissive reply, I ask back with a puzzled and stern expression. Then Lewis shouts back, looking annoyed. "What's with that look? Let me have my retirement fun!" With that, Lewis leaves the living room and I'm left alone. I'm stunned, unable to retort after being yelled at for the first time in a while. I felt utterly pathetic and decided to just call it a day. Days passed and Lewis left for his golf outing early in the morning. Tomorrow was finally the day of our trip, so I decided to double-check everything to make sure nothing was amiss. Finding no issues, I decided to anxiously await Lewis's return. Morning broke without him, and I woke up early, perhaps due to my anxiety. We had a flight to catch in the evening for our trip, and I'd feel at ease only if he came back after noon. Time crawled by, and even after noon, Lewis still hadn't returned. Feeling overwhelmed with anxiety, I tried calling Lewis, but got no answer. I tried reaching out multiple times, but still no response. Pacing the floor and glancing at the clock, I finally lost my patience when Lewis eventually called me. "What are you doing? Where are you? We're running out of time!" Before even hearing Lewis's voice, I blurted out my concerns. Just as I was about to ask him to hurry home, Lewis interrupted me. "Sorry, but I can't make it in time. Go ahead without me. I'll catch up." His voice carried a slight tone of apology. Then he hung up abruptly. Stunned, I immediately tried calling him back, but he didn't answer. Resigned, I got ready and headed to the airport. On my way, I stood before the airport staff holding 2 tickets, explaining the situation. Once I arrived, I had to repeat my story to the puzzled hotel receptionist during check-in. I tried calling Lewis to let him know I was at the hotel, but got no response. Feeling miserable, I ate dinner and spent the night crying. At dawn, I checked out of the hotel. I canceled all my plans for the day and went home. "Lewis, are you home?" Opening the door, I found no signs of Lewis. As I entered the living room, I noticed a piece of paper on the table. Curious, I looked at it and realized it was a filled-out divorce application. I slumped into a chair, utterly defeated. I sat like that in the now silent house for some time. Fast forward 3 years. I'm walking home from my part-time job. The streets are beginning to darken, and while nothing has changed in these 3 years, I certainly have. Taking a deep breath that resembles a sigh, I adjust the eco bag of groceries I'm holding and look up at the darkening sky as I reach my front door. Then I notice it. The lights are on in the house. For a moment, my heart trembles. I rush in and find unfamiliar luggage. Shocked, I ponder what's going on. Just then, I heard a familiar voice saying something quite intrusive. As I lift my head, overwhelmed with an indescribable discomfort, there stood Lewis, who had disappeared without a trace 3 years ago. I couldn't help my astonishment as Lewis looked down on me with a smug grin. Before I could ponder why, Lewis impatiently called out, "Got home, didn't I? Give me a beer and some fancy steak, now!" Stunned, I watched as a satisfied Lewis retreated to the living room. As I followed him into the room, Lewis was already engrossed in the TV, looking quite disheveled. Wearing dirty sweatpants and his hair a mess, Lewis even sported an unshaven beard and a protruding belly. I left the living room without saying a word. Lewis noticed my silence and followed me out, badgering me with relentless chatter, but I wasn't listening. I walked around the house, went into the room we use for storage, and pulled out a suitable bag. I started to pack what I needed. "Hey, don't ignore me! You know I hate being ignored!" Apparently unable to handle being ignored any longer, Lewis yelled and grabbed my arm. "I came home for you, and this is how you act?" I shook off Lewis's hand and said firmly, "Don't expect me to be the same as before. I'm going home, to my parents' house." "Wait, your parents' house?" Lewis was bewildered, unable to grasp what I was saying. Ignoring him, I left the house and quickly dialed a number on my mobile phone. I pack enough essentials in my bag for a decent period and head towards the comforting home. Along the way, I make a phone call. I knew it might be an inconvenient time, but I couldn't care less at that moment. The person on the other end seemed somewhat surprised, but quickly agreed to my coming, so I hurried on my way. After arriving, I pressed the doorbell. The person who greeted me made me burst into tears. "Welcome! Come on in!" said the person who warmly welcomed me and handed me a towel as I sat near the stove. I thanked them and buried my face into the towel. The different scent of the place oddly comforted me, helping me calm down. They made me coffee in the meantime, which was handed over gently. I love this coffee. The coffee served in this former in-laws' house. Joanna listened to my story just like she had 3 years ago, occasionally nodding. It was Joanna I turned to when I felt lost, left behind by Lewis with divorce papers. Keeping my eyes dry, I explained my situation to Joanna. She kindly invited me to her house. Where I ended up running to was my ex-in-laws' place. Again, Joanna listened to my story attentively. Glancing at my phone that had been ringing, she suggested, "For now, try calling Lewis over here." Taking her advice, I returned one of Lewis's many calls and told him to come. But Lewis just yelled incomprehensible things and hung up. Seeing my disappointed face, Joanna smiled and started dialing. "Hey, Lewis, come home, right now." Though Joanna spoke in a firm yet gentle tone, it seemed Lewis's response was unchanged. Gripping the phone tightly, Joanna warned, "Crystal is crying. If you don't want to sever ties with me, who's helped you out, come home, now." She hung up without even waiting for Lewis's reply. I had never seen Joanna raise her voice like that, and to my surprise, my tears had retreated. "Don't be startled. He'll be here soon. Then we'll teach him a lesson together," she said, turning to me with her usual warm smile. As we sipped coffee and continued chatting, the front door suddenly became noisy. Joanna slowly got up and headed for the entrance. "What's with all the racket? You're bothering the neighbors?" Unlocking the door and letting Lewis in, Joanna pulled him by the ear toward me. She seated Lewis where she had been sitting and took a seat next to me. Turning to Lewis, she just said, "Well?" and sipped her coffee. Lewis looked puzzled for a moment, but quickly started shouting and pointing at me. "This woman ignored me and left, even though I came home for her. I thought she'd be lonely since I've been gone for so long." Feeling my anger rise at Lewis's words, I was about to retort, but Joanna interjected. "Where exactly have you been, and what have you been doing for the last 3 years?" Lewis was at a loss for words. Back then, I had clung to Joanna and tried contacting Lewis in the same way. Whether he had blocked my calls or not, he was unreachable. Even Joanna couldn't get through. So it was good that we could contact him and get him to this time. Seizing the opportunity, Joanna pressed Lewis. "With which woman are you this time?" "What do you mean, which?" Lewis's face twisted as he looked at me. I waited for Lewis's response, keeping my poker face. I couldn't believe Lewis thought I had no idea. After all he's done, there's no way I wouldn't know. After explaining everything at Joanna's place, she suggested hiring a private investigator to dig up on Lewis. And just like that, his numerous affairs came to light. He wasn't working late. He was clubbing and had been spending freely there for ages. Once I found out the extent of his shenanigans, I reported back to Joanna. She broke down, apologized, and we both immediately filed the already completed divorce papers. Joanna comforted me, telling me to forget about Lewis. Thanks to her, I was able to move on. Now, here he was, back to ruin everything. Gathering myself, I blurted out, "I bet you had a great time leading your double life." At this, Lewis's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to yell, but Joanna slammed her cup down, silencing him. Lewis startled and quickly recomposed himself. We're well aware of your affairs, I continued. You left us, your family, to have your fun. So you'd rather go on trips with your mistress than with me, huh? Yes, Lewis had ignored our planned trip to go on a vacation with his then mistress. He had lied, saying it was a golf weekend. I was devastated when I found out. I had tried to forget, but as it all came rushing back, my anger boiled over. You knew? How? No, forget that. Forgive me, Crystal. I won't do it again. Lewis pleaded, clearly unable to bear being glared at by both me and Joanna. But forgiveness was off the table. Joanna snapped. Do you have any idea how much Crystal suffered? Your pathetic apology won't cut it. Now it's your turn to feel miserable. Her voice, strong for someone well into her 90s, made Lewis stifle a scream. He turned to me. I'm sorry. Really. Let's go on a trip to make up for it. Just the two of us. I'll pay for everything. I don't know what you're thinking, but there's no way I'm going on a trip with you. Besides, we're not even married anymore. What? He tried to sweet-talk me when he failed with my mom, but it was too late. We were already divorced. Lewis must have still thought I was his wife, blissfully ignorant. What a convenient delusion. Hey, come on. That was just a joke. Oh, really? But I don't like jokes like that. When I casually responded, Lewis turned ghostly pale. After that, Joanna and I completely ignored Lewis as he tried to explain himself. At first, Lewis yelled and screamed, but when he saw he was being ignored, he ended up crying like a child. Joanna told me that even after his disappearance, Lewis had been coming to get money from her. By then, I had started taking action in my own life, so I never contacted him. He was still finding ways to get money, though. Joanna had been keeping tabs on him. She knew what he was up to. It was a tough time for me, but it must have been equally hard for Joanna to keep it all to herself. Thinking back, it feels overwhelming. When Lewis eventually fell asleep, Joanna and I discussed our next steps. Apparently, Lewis had been kicked out by a woman he was close to, so he had nowhere to live. So he would live with Joanna for the time being, and I would consult a lawyer to claim compensation from him. I couldn't let this opportunity slip away. However, Lewis couldn't afford to pay, so Joanna would cover the compensation for me. With a plan in place, I took action immediately. A few days later, the compensation was transferred to my account. Lewis seemed relieved that he didn't have to pay, but all that changed was that he now owed the money to Joanna instead of me. Nothing was resolved. Joanna updates me occasionally. Lewis is using age-friendly employment opportunities to work and pay her back. Almost reaching her 100th birthday, Joanna seems to manage the slacker Lewis just fine. I hope she stays strong for many more years. As for me, I went back to my childhood home the moment I confirmed the transfer. This is where I truly grew up, and I returned to take care of my ailing mother. I had given her a lot to worry about. From now on, I intend to live a more laid-back life while taking care of her.